The Assistants API is probably one of the more confusing APIs to work with, but if you figure it out, it is one of the most powerful ones to use for all your AI applications. In this video, I'm going to walk you through step by step how the Assistant API works, a few examples on how to actually implement its core functions. I'm going to show you an example of how we can use function calling to connect Perplexity API with an Assistant API to be able to do research in real time. And at the end of the video, I have a special Easter egg to show you how to use the Assistant API from right within ChatGPT to create your assistants without even writing a line of code. If this sounds like something that's interesting and helpful, stick around. It's going to be a bit of a long video. So if you want to grab your cup of coffee or water, probably a good time to pause the video, grab that so we can kind of go through everything. Awesome. So the first thing I want to go through is how the Assistant API works at a high level, just because there's so many moving parts. And if you read the documentation on their website, it's super helpful, but there's a lot going on in different places, so it's hard to kind of centralize all that information. If you look at this diagram I put together here, you basically have the assistant on the left-hand side, and then you have the thread on the right-hand side. The assistant is pretty much when you go into the OpenAI playground and you go to assistants and you click create, you're pretty much just entering a title and then the description of the underlying assistant. The different parameters you have at your disposal include the model you're gonna choose, so whether it's GPT-4 Turbo, GPT-4 Omni, 3.5 Turbo, and whether or not you wanna attach any files to the vector database, which is also a new feature. And the last two are the actual instructions, which is pretty much your prompt, and the tools. And this is really the one that I want to focus on later on in this tutorial, which is how to leverage tools to access multiple APIs all at once. Being able to add tools to your assistant will take your AI agent from good to great. And with the example code we're going to go through today, you're going to be able to implement an assistant in under 15 lines of code and even add PDFs and text files by just drag and dropping them into Google Colab. So we're going to take care of all of that very shortly. When it comes to the thread object here, it's very simple. This is pretty much what manages the conversation and maintains that history of the conversation or thread, which is pretty much just sending a message to this assistant, goes through its instructions, it goes through its knowledge base if it has one, and if it has any tools, it scans through to see very quickly, is there a tool that should be invoked based on what the user is asking me for. So the thread is really just managing the conversation, while all the real plumbing and the hard work goes into actually building and setting up the assistant properly. Now in this portion here, which is the run step, this is going to happen every single time the thread object communicates with the assistant object. And there's many statuses, but the most common ones that you'll see are complete, in progress, requires action, canceled, expired, queued, and failed. So really quick, requires action typically pops up if you have a tool or you've used function calling with your assistant where it's looking and it's realizing that it has to look for a tool or an API based on what the user is asking for. So it scans through its tools to see what it has at its disposal. With in progress and complete, you'll see these pretty much all the time. Every time you actually invoke your assistant, it starts running and then it gets queued, then it goes in progress. Then eventually, if everything's okay, it actually goes to complete. For expired, this will pop up if your assistant is hanging, meaning it's looking for a function or an action, but maybe that action is not configured properly. So it'll keep hanging until it expires indefinitely, and then you'd have to restart that instance or restart that session with the assistant. The other ones are pretty straightforward. So canceled usually would be from your end that you're actually canceling the operation, and failed means that it probably iterated, it expired, and there was no user input, so it eventually just timed out and stopped working. There are a few other statuses on their actual website that you can look up. I'm just going over the main ones that popped out to me and the ones that I see most common when you're actually implementing these functions. And with that, that's pretty much the big picture. You have the assistant, you have the thread, and then as a user, you're just interacting with the thread object when you're sending a message, and all the actual underlying plumbing is here. So that's pretty much how it works in a nutshell. And we're going to actually dive in right now into actual code to see how we can set up our first agent, check on an existing one to see if it exists, and actually create one using the brand new feature of vector database, which I loved because this puts us on the roadmap to not have to use custom RAG anymore, which I think in a year's time will be all built in to these custom agents. So we're going to dive in directly to some code here. Now, a little bit of a trick before we dive into the code directly is when you see the documentation on their website, and pretty much any documentation you encounter with all these new frameworks coming out, my little tip and trick is I just have my virtual assistant go through the documentation and just copy paste everything into a Google Doc so that I can take that Google Doc, drop it into an LLM, and actually have a back and forth conversation with it to better understand the documentation and how different pieces kind of get put together. My favorite LLMs to do this right now are Claude Opus, just because it's so smart and it's really good at coding ability. And I also tested out GPT-4 Omni, which is pretty helpful at telling you how to implement OpenAI's schemas, especially given that it knows quite a bit about OpenAI to begin with. That's just a nugget for you. Take it or leave it. One thing I'm going to make available to you is just the Assistant API documentation that I scraped, or my virtual assistant scraped and pasted for me in a document. So I'll put these both in the description below that you can have access to in case you just want to take it, plop it into an LLM, and have a conversation with it about how to implement code for your specific use case. If you don't know how to code, I hope you don't click away, just because 90% of the code that I'm going to show you, I generated iteratively using ChatGPT and just going back and forth every single time I encountered some form of issue. So with that being said, I'm going to dive straight into the code here. So if we go into Google Colab and you've not used it before, pretty much all you have to do is, if I just restart our runtime here, I'll just delete this. All you got to click is connect, and then it's going to take its time to spin up an instance. There we go. So all we're going to do is just go here and click on pip install OpenAI, and then we're also going to install PyPDF2. I'll tell you why we're installing this. Some of the documents that I want to upload to the vector database are PDFs. So this library just allows me to drag and drop and handle that PDF to be able to convert it into the right format for the Assistants API. We go to the very first set of code. I'm going to walk through every block here step by step, and you'll see that I put together a small GUI for you in Google Colab so that it's easy for you to take your API keys and plop them in there instead of sifting through the code and looking for where to implement it. So in this case, I'm just setting up our OpenAI instance. I'm putting my API key, which I will delete by the end of this video, and I'm just setting the client up, and this is the syntax to do that. So once I click play, that just commits it to memory, so I can now apply this to all the other functions we're running in this workbook. So if we go to the first one, I'm just going to look up an existing assistant that I've created in the past, just to show you the type of metadata that you get when you're checking on the existence of an assistant you've already made. So if we click on play here, you'll see that I entered the assistant ID here. So you can just plop in yours, and then you'll see this is the metadata of when it was created, the description that I've given it, the instructions or the prompt pretty much, and then the model that I assigned it, which was GPT-4 Turbo, the name, any tool that it was associated with. In this case, I uploaded an actual PDF, so it knows to use the file search tool when invoked, and then just the temperature and all the other metadata that you're used to seeing. One new component here, if you've never used the new version of the Assistant API, is this vector store ID. So anytime you actually upload a PDF now or a file, instead of just clipping it as a PDF, as you would right now in your custom GPTs, you can upload it to create a new vector store, and that's what really is doing the RAG behind the scenes. So if we want to actually go from checking on an existing one to creating our own brand new assistant, this is the code that we need to accomplish that. You'll see here that I made available in a GUI your vector store name. You can name it whatever you want, a path to any PDFs or files that you have, and then a description for the assistant, and then a model. So in this case, I just came up with 4 models to put in list form. If you actually wanted to go into my code and change it for yourself, all you'd have to do is just write a comma here and then write the name of the actual model. That being said, before we run it, I'm just going to walk through very quickly what's going on. So over here in the vector store name, we're calling it future of work. This code creates the actual vector store. This has the path to my PDF. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag and drop this PDF, which is pretty meaty. It's around 80 pages, and it's about the future of work. So I'll just drag and drop that. This goes through, this is using the PyPDF2 library that I alluded to earlier. This actually takes the PDF, breaks it down into text, so that we can actually upload the file into the vector database. This check status of the file, I wrote this in so that it tells me whether or not it's been uploaded successfully, and the other stuff is pretty self-explanatory. So the assistant description is what you're calling it. The assistant model is what we've configured it as. This is the actual code that you'd get from the Assistant API documentation to create the brand new assistant. And this is the code here that will upload the file and create the vector store and give us some feedback that it actually ended up creating it. And last thing here, we're just going to create a thread so I can demo having a quick conversation with it. Although in this one, it won't be a back and forth. It'll just tell us that it created a thread that we could have a conversation with if we wanted to. So now that being said, I'll just be able to run this code here. It's going to iterate through. And it's going to take a bit of time just because it's a very meaty file. Now I can actually just open it up. In the meantime, you see it's about the future of work. It's pretty hefty. It's around, I stand corrected, 288 pages, not 80 pages. So it's quite meaty, so it'll take around 2 to 3 minutes to fully run. When it does, it's going to just tell us here that it's been uploaded successfully, and then we'll be able to actually use this agent. Awesome, so it finished. Our file status is completed. This is our brand new assistant ID, and I'll just keep this ID handy because we'll use it later. And then it tells me that it's been uploaded successfully to the vector store, which is all good there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to my assistants page, and I'll just refresh just to see if we actually set it up properly. And you'll see here, if we click on the assistant, it's all set up. We have the actual vector database all ready to go. And the one thing that I have not figured out yet is how to enable file search programmatically from the backend. It might be something that I overlooked, but all you have to do to enable it using my code is just click on this toggle. So it puts it as on by default. I don't know if it's a feature or a bug that I wasn't able to do this. If it's a feature, it makes sense because maybe I don't want to be charged to actually host this file in the assistant API without my consent. So if you do know how to do this programmatically, let me know in the comments below. Super curious on how that's done. Outside of that, you just have to toggle this yourself. Aside from that, you've just created your first assistant programmatically with a vector database, so good job. We're gonna go back now and we're gonna go down and see what does it look like if you wanna add multiple files to a vector database at once, instead of just one PDF at one time. So in this version of the code, a lot of the stuff is the same. I'm just gonna drop 2 text files from my folder. So we'll just take this real estate Canada and real estate US, and I'll drop it here. Now that they're synced up, I can refer to them in a path here. And if you're not familiar how to get the path in Google Colab, all you have to do is just right click on copy path. You go here, paste it, and in the code itself, you'll see it dynamically updates again because the GUI is just directly linked to it. So again, we have the same thing here. We're naming the vector database. We're creating the actual vector store. We're adding the 2 files here. In this case, I just have an array that I'm adding instead of just one individual file. Then we're looping through, adding both files. And then again, we're just creating a brand new assistant here. You could totally just update an existing assistant with that information, and I'll show that in the next portion here. And when it comes to creating the assistant, we're just updating it with the vector store after we've actually set it up. And if we click run, you'll see this one's a lot quicker because the files are pretty light compared to the last one. So in this case, we have a brand new ID for the vector store, and this is the batch ID for the actual vectorization of those files, and we're all good to go. Now if we go down here, if we go back to our first assistant, let's just recopy that ID. Let's take this one here. And this code is for updating an assistant. So if I took this one here and I pasted it, and we wanted to name it something brand new instead of future of jobs assistant, we want to name it maybe the cool robot assistant. And then description, we want it to be, hi, how are you? And then we just click on the play button. You'll see here we've updated that existing assistant from before, which was created a few minutes ago. The description is now, hi, how are you? There's no instructions as of yet, and you'll see the name is now the cool assistant. And if we go back to the assistant here and refresh, you'll see it's now called the cool robot assistant. So that works perfectly fine. Now back to the code. I just wanted to visually show you how the assistant looks like when it's running a specific task. So in this case, I'm just going to put in the brand new ID, and then we're going to write a prompt, which is, tell me about the best jobs in AI. And then we'll just click play here. All the code is pretty much the same, except at the bottom here, we're now using the run status portion of the API, which basically just shows you what it's going through when it's running the thread. So in this case, you'll see first it's queued, like we discussed before, then it's in progress, and then it's completed, and it says run completed. This is more custom from my end. The actual API will tell you completed. Now there's no back and forth, there's no chat history. I just wanted to show you the underlying plumbing, how that works, that when it's running behind the scenes and taking time, you know what it's doing behind the scenes. So if we want to actually have a conversation with our assistant, with the vector database, what we can do is I'll go scroll up to get the assistant ID and the associated vector store ID, so we can actually have a back and forth conversation with it and send a message to see what it looks like. So if we go back up to our initial assistant, I'm going to grab the assistant ID here, paste it here, and then we'll go and grab the associated vector store ID. So we'll grab this, copy it and then paste it here. Then we'll ask it a question. What is the best job in AI? And then we'll click play, and you'll see the thread is now being set up and created. It's going to send that message to the assistant, and it will return a response that says value equals and the actual response from the assistant. So you can see here, it comes back with an answer. Determining the best job in artificial intelligence largely depends on interests, skills, etc., etc. But yeah, you can see that it works with this one message. And what I'll go through next is a bit of more of a conversational interface that you can demo in Google Colab, so you can get a sense for how it's actually going to interact when you go in the wild. So it's kind of like your programmatic alternative to using the OpenAI Assistants Playground. So if we go to the bottom here, let's use the exact same credentials. So I'm just going to grab this, paste it there. We'll grab our vector store ID, paste it here. All right. And in this section, in terms of updates to the code, I basically have this thing while true, which will run on infinitely until you quit the actual session. You can have a conversation and it'll keep sending that request to the Assistants API that you've set up. So in this case, at the very bottom, it's just going to tell us that we're having a conversation with that assistant. And if we click play, it's going to ask me, what's your question? And if I say, what do you know in general? It's going to send that as a question. And instead of just cutting off after the first response, it's going to allow me to ask more and more questions as I please. There we go. So we got an answer. I can help you with a wide range of tasks and queries, but not limited to information about historical events, So if I ask it, how are you doing in general, just as a test case, it'll just keep going on and on until I decide to quit. So you'll see here, if I write quit, there we go, terminates the program, and we know that it works, and we know that this agent can have a back and forth. That's it for the core portions. If you understand how to use this stuff, you can set up an assistant, update one, have a conversation with one without even jumping into the OpenAI playground. That's pretty much it for the core functions. So this gives you everything you need to create your first assistant, update your assistant, and add any files to the vector database programmatically, and even have a conversation with it without jumping into the OpenAI Assistant Playground. Well, this next part is going to be a bit more beefy when we get into function calling and how that works. It's honestly a bit complex, so if you want to take a bit of a break right now, probably a good time, then we'll get back and keep going. If you want to just push through, stick around, and then I'll go through this next portion, which is the Assistants API, but with function calling. Now I'm going to go through the Assistants API function calling portion of this tutorial, and just to go back to our handy dandy little diagram here, we're going to be focusing purely on this portion, which is the tools section of the assistant. And in my opinion, the more complicated portion to actually implement. Everything else, like you saw in the first round of code, isn't too complex. It's not rocket science. 90% of that was their actual code in their documentation. When it comes to tools, that's when you're dealing with custom Python functions. You're dealing with a lot more nuance in terms of managing multiple tools at the same time. And there's different ways to actually implement it. So I went researching for the best ways to do it and the best functions to write to make it easier to add more and more tools as time goes on. All right, so if we go back and we go into function calling, I'm just going to do a pip install for OpenAI. And the reason why I have this double dash upgrade is sometimes just because it's a newer framework, it doesn't always use the right OpenAI version. If you do the double dash upgrade, it just makes sure you're using the latest and greatest version of OpenAI. All right, so that's all installed. So I'm going to walk through this code step by step here because it's very different from the last portion we saw, and there's a lot more nuance. So here we're just doing the imports. So importing OS, we're importing JSON, and the reason why, I have a new function that creates a new assistant, and if there's an ID already in the JSON in our session, or in your case, if it's stored on your environment, it won't create a net new one. It'll just use that assistant ID. If there isn't a JSON file, which if you're firing up Google Colab for the first time, there won't, it'll create a brand new assistant. So if we go down here, we're just setting up our OpenAI key, and this is my Perplexity API key that I'll delete at the end of this tutorial. And if we go down, this is the actual function that we're calling. So it's called Perplexity search, and pretty much how it works is it sends a prompt to the Perplexity API, and it comes back with a response, and we pass that response back to the assistant. And you'll see here, it takes a parameter query, which just stands for anything that's being sent to this function. And in this case, what's being sent is the user message from the thread directly to the function. So in this case, we look at the messages. In this case, it's just a system prompt. You are an artificial intelligence assistant, and you need to engage in helpful, detailed, and polite conversation with a user. You can change this to whatever you want. This is just the boilerplate out of the box. And if you're wondering how I figured out how to actually access Perplexity from a backend perspective, if you go to Perplexity and you actually pay for the tool, if you go to the bottom left here on settings and you go to the API documentation and you go to docs and you go to API reference, it'll show you how to use their completions endpoint as well as all the models that you can select from. So anything that has the suffix -online will be the ones that are actually connected to the internet. So you can see here, this one, 32K large online, and then you have the small equivalent here. You can use the large one if you want, but it takes a bit more time, adds more latency. So just to keep things nimble, I like to use a small one, especially when it comes to very minor queries that might come up. You don't need some very large behemoth query running. So if we go back, so that's this function here. And what we do is we load the actual assistant and we create that JSON like I said. So once I run this, this will populate a JSON file on the left-hand side. And I'll pop that out. And if we go down, I'm setting up the assistant in a bit of a different way. So right now I'm creating it and I'm giving it the instructions saying you are a helpful assistant that can perform searches using the Perplexity API. In this case, let's use GPT-4 Turbo just to change things up. And then this is the part that really differs from our last portions of code. We instantiate a tools variable. And in here we say that we're instantiating a type function. I actually call the name of the function that we know now is Perplexity Search. I give it the description, and this is super important. You want to try to be a bit extra verbose with a description so that if you have multiple tools, the assistant's able to find the best one that matches the use case of the user. So the better your description, the more easy it actually invokes it when it's the right time. And then if we go to parameters, this is a more boilerplate stuff, just defining what kind of payload we're dealing with, which is a type string in terms of the query or being sent. In this case, the required actual parameter is the user query from the Assistants API. So for the rest of the code here, it's very familiar to what we did before, which is I'm just creating a little simulation here of how to interact with this agent once it's set up. And you'll see it's going to keep going until I say quit, which is familiar from what we did before. And then down here, this part is very important in terms of differentiating what we've done before. If you remember on our diagram, we talked about a few different run statuses. In this case, the require action is going to pop up here because if the Assistants API identifies that we need to use an action or call a function for the user's query, it has to go and actually introspect and reflect. Okay, it seems like we require an action. Which action should I pick? Or which function should I select? So if we go back here, that's why we're setting it up saying if the run status is equal to requires action, then go through your tools and look for the right tool to call. Now here Pythonically, if you're feeling a bit jittery as to what you're looking at, it was a bit complex, but again, 80% of this was generated through GPT through iteration, and then 20% was me kind of just putting things together and asking it to create different functions to make it more malleable. So in this case, you'll see we have three statuses, either completed, failed, or requires action. And I'm asking it to print it out while we're having the conversation. So if I run this bad boy right here and we scroll to the bottom, you'll see that it's created a brand new assistant because the JSON file didn't actually exist before. If we go to the left-hand side, and you'll see right here, I have a new JSON file. If I double click it, you'll see that we have the new ID. So if I was to rerun this, like basically stop and rerun it, it shouldn't create a new assistant because it should go into that JSON file, see that there's already an ID, and then use that ID to actually have that conversation. So other than that, we have the assistant ID here, we have the thread ID, and if I ask it a question, what are the latest NBA scores from the playoffs as of May 20th? So because it's May 20th, hopefully it doesn't actually use the Assistants API remembrance of May 20th, 2023. Okay, it did, so I'll be more specific. What were the NBA scores from the playoffs yesterday, May 20th, 2024. So hopefully this should invoke it to know that it needs to use the Perplexity action since it has no training as of 2024. So fingers crossed this works. So you can see here, it has identified it needs to require the function Perplexity search. So that's good. And if we go down, there we go. The Boston Celtics have advanced to the Eastern Conference Finals, and it's going through all the latest information and the schedule for the upcoming NBA playoffs. So this worked, and this shows also how important it is to be descriptive in your function. If anything, I should say that if the user is asking for something after 2023, make sure you always invoke the Perplexity function. That's just an example, and it's a really good fail to show you to kind of encourage you to be more specific when you write these instructions. So if I just write quit here, we're all good. And that's pretty much how you actually write a function call and use it in an assistant. So if I go back to our assistants tab here and I refresh and I go to this brand new assistant that I just created, you'll see here, you are a helpful assistant that performs searches using the Perplexity API. And you can see right here, we have the actual tool. It's embedded as a function. So we know that that's worked and it's updated. And obviously you could add all that extra metadata in terms of name, any other components that you want to add, and maybe even files you want to upload as a knowledge base. The part here that makes this super powerful is that if you upload a knowledge base and you have functions to call and you have a really good prompt, one assistant, it's super powerful because depending on the user query, if everything is well structured and well described, it's going to be smart enough to pick the right tool at the right time and invoke the knowledge base when it makes the most sense, when it has to kind of check its notes for anything internal. And to orchestrate that, you want to write a very bespoke prompt. I haven't created a video just yet on how to write prompts. I'm going to create one very soon on actually how to get AI to write your prompts for you. So stay tuned for that. Now, just to finish off here, I ended up creating a Replit microservice that uses the code that I just showed you, but I just host it in Replit in a very easy to use way so I can call it from different APIs without having to reset up everything I just showed you manually in tools like VoiceFlow or anything else that accepts an API. So if we go to Postman, you'll see that I've created a service called Assistant API Tools Replit.app, and then the path or the route to actually access my Perplexity search is through /assistant. If I write that same sample query here, what were the scores from the NHL in the past week as of May 21, 2024, and I send that request, it should come up with a response, meaning that we can use this from anywhere and we can access it from anywhere. Meaning you can use this in VoiceFlow, in ChatGPT as a custom action, and it really broadens your horizons in terms of where you can use these assistants. And you'll see here, it's come up with the responses. So it's having issues retrieving the results. So if I just say, what were the scores from the NHL? I have no idea if there were any games as of May 19th, 2024. And let's run that. Okay, so I was wrong about May 19th being the day that there were games, but it seems to be smart enough to know that on May 18th there were games. So you can see here, this was the score, and we know it works, and we can use this now wherever we want. If you made it this far and you're enjoying this type of content and the level of depth that I'm going into, let me know in the comments below, subscribe to the channel, and give it a like before we get to the last portion here, which is our Easter egg on how to actually use this microservice within ChatGPT. So you can see here in our last tab, I created a custom GPT called the Assistant Factory, where you can create, update, or send a message to an existing assistant. So this is pretty much using all the functions that I went through in the first portion of the code. So if we click on Create New Assistant, it's going to ask us 4 key things: the name of the assistant, the description, any instructions we want to write, and the OpenAI model we want to use. In this case, I'm going to tell it, come up with your own agent that specializes in giving travel tips. Come up with the prompt, description, etc. yourself. Basically the lazy man's method. There we go. So it's come up with its own description. It's come up with its own prompt. That's a bit of a preview on how to write your own prompt using AI. It's selected GPT-4 on its own. And if I say yes to proceeding with the details, it should invoke my microservice that I built in Replit. Awesome. And we're going to click confirm. And in under 3 to 4 seconds, it should create an assistant for us. And there it is. It created travel tipster. And this is the new assistant ID, which is awesome. If we go to our assistants tab and we just do a hard refresh, there it is. And there's the instructions and the GPT-4 model. Now, one thing I'm trying to figure out that I haven't just yet is how can I upload a file in ChatGPT to automatically embed and vectorize. So that might be coming up soon. If you already figured that out, let me know in the comments below. I would love to learn from you. So if we go back here, we can actually send a message to this assistant now. So if I say, send a sample message to this assistant, and we say, what should I do in Dubai next week? It should invoke the agent to take the assistant ID that it just created and send it a message programmatically. If I click on confirm, awesome, there we go. So you can see it's sent a message to the assistant. It's come up with my itinerary for Dubai, and then you see it works perfectly. Now we could continue to do more things like update the assistant, etc. But I just wanted to show you how ubiquitous the solution can be once you've figured it out. In terms of the actual custom instructions for this custom GPT, I made them quite robust here. But you can see it's pretty much referencing the 3 functions: create assistant, update assistant, and conversation with assistant. And that's kind of those 3 main functions where I describe to it what the goal is. And if you create an assistant, use that assistant that you have in memory to have a conversation with it. So all that I did programmatically here, but the bare bones of it actually lives in Replit. So before we close up, I'm just going to show you what that Replit code looks like. If you haven't used Replit before, you've not watched any of my other videos, Replit allows you to build small microservices that are kind of like pseudo APIs where you can paste code and you just adjust it for Replit to create basically a Flask app with a root. And that root is pretty much how you're going to invoke that. And if we look at the code, a lot of this stuff will be familiar. So if we go down here, we have 3 main roots. We have one root to create the assistant, where it's a post method because we're actually posting the message from ChatGPT directly to here. And then it is taking these 4 main components that you can configure as you wish, which is name, description, instructions, and model. And then if I go down here, the next one is the update assistant root, where it's exact same format, except in this case, it is taking the description, name, and instructions that you're adding. In this case, it's updating the existing assistant instead of creating a net new set of descriptions and instructions. And the last one is the /conversation root, where you're able to actually have that back and forth, and you're basically creating a thread behind the scenes. So that's where you see here, try creating a thread, and in that thread, embed that specific message that you're sending. So that's how we're actually making all those work behind the scenes. And you'll see here, I've been trying to work on this create vector database portion of the code, but I haven't figured it out just yet. If it does make sense, and if I do figure it out, I'll just update the description with the updated code. Otherwise, let me know how to get to it if you've already figured it out. So if we go to the bottom here, pretty much everything, you can just take my code, throw it to ChatGPT. If something's confusing you, just ask it to walk you through step by step, and you'll be good from there. All right, you've reached the end of the video, and hopefully this would have helped you understand how the Assistant API works, the main functions of it, how to use function calls, and even how to use it within ChatGPT. It might be super daunting to use the Assistants API at first, but once you get a handle on it, it becomes really easy and really quick to build very bespoke agent experiences without breaking your back. So it's basically do all the hard work once, and then after that, you can ask ChatGPT to manipulate these functions, update the instructions, and it's all done for you. So if you enjoyed this content, let me know in the comments below, and let me know if there are other tutorials that you'd like me to do.